Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Close your eyes, lean back, immerse yourself in the story, and get ready to drift off to sleep in peace. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Imagine a night in January, somewhere in medieval Europe, centuries before electricity, central heating, or modern medicine. The wind finds every gap in a timber wall. The only light comes from a single struggling fire, its smoke curling toward a hole in the roof rather than a proper chimney. Outside, the temperature has dropped well below freezing, and inside, an entire family, sometimes alongside their most valuable livestock, huddles together beneath every blanket, cloak, and animal skin they own, simply trying to make it to morning. For the vast majority of people living in medieval Europe, winter was not a season of holiday cheer and snowy charm. It was the most dangerous and physically demanding stretch of the entire year, a month-long test of preparation, resourcefulness, and sheer endurance that could mean the difference between life and death for the poorest members of society. Over the next few hours, we will explore, in careful historical detail, exactly how ordinary medieval people, not kings or nobles in their well-stocked castles, but the peasants, laborers, and townsfolk who made up the overwhelming majority of the medieval population, actually survived the cold, dark months of winter, from the practical architecture of their homes to the food stored away months in advance, and in doing so, we will gain a genuinely deeper appreciation for a struggle that shaped nearly every aspect of medieval daily life. Chapter 1: A colder world than we imagine. Before examining how medieval people survived winter, it is worth understanding the actual climate they were surviving, since popular imagination sometimes flattens the medieval period, roughly the 5th through 15th centuries, into a single uniform climate experience, when in fact it spanned genuinely significant climatic variation. Climate historians have identified what is commonly called the medieval warm period, lasting roughly from the 10th through 13th centuries, during which much of Europe experienced somewhat milder average temperatures than the centuries that followed, conditions that historians link to documented agricultural expansion during this period, including the successful cultivation of vineyards in parts of England considerably farther north than would prove viable in later, colder centuries. This relatively milder period gave way, beginning in the 14th century and intensifying across the following several centuries, to a period climate historians term the Little Ice Age, characterized by measurably colder average temperatures, more frequent severe winters, and a documented increase in the freezing of major European rivers, including the Thames in London, which froze solidly enough on multiple documented occasions in these centuries to support organized ice fairs directly on its surface. This climatic shift coincided with, and historians believe significantly contributed to, several of the most severe documented famines and agricultural crises of the later medieval period, since even a modest reduction in average growing season temperature could meaningfully shorten the agricultural window available for medieval farmers working without modern crop varieties, fertilizers, or mechanized equipment, meaning that winter survival for medieval people existed within a broader and genuinely precarious annual cycle of food production that left very little margin for error across an entire year, not merely during the coldest months themselves. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Warmth. The medieval peasant home, for the great majority of the rural population who made up the overwhelming share of medieval society, bore little resemblance to the stone castles and grand cathedrals that dominate popular imagination of the period. Most peasant dwellings were modest single- or two-room structures, commonly built using a timber frame filled with wattle and daub, a construction technique combining woven wooden strips with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung, plastered over the frame to create walls that while far less durable and weatherproof than stone, were considerably cheaper and faster to construct and repair, a practical necessity for a population with extremely limited surplus resources to invest in their housing. Roofing typically consisted of thatch, densely bundled straw, or reed layered to shed rainwater and provide a meaningful, though imperfect, degree of insulation against the cold. And the interior heating source for the great majority of these homes through much of the medieval period was a simple, open central hearth, a fire built directly on the floor, or a low raised platform near the center of the main living space, with smoke allowed to rise and gradually escape through a hole in the roof or gaps beneath the eaves, since the true chimney, channeling smoke through an enclosed flue, remained, for much of the earlier medieval period, a genuine luxury feature found primarily in wealthier homes and did not become common in ordinary peasant dwellings until considerably later in the medieval period, meaning that for centuries, most medieval families lived with smoke as a constant. And, by modern standards, genuinely hazardous feature of daily indoor winter life, a documented contributor to significant respiratory health problems that medieval medicine had no real means of addressing. Chapter 3: Sharing the roof with the herd. One of the most practically significant and historically well-documented medieval winter survival strategies involved the deliberate housing of livestock within or immediately adjacent to the family's own living space during the coldest months, a building arrangement historians refer to using the French term longhouse or the related concept of the byre dwelling, in which animals such as cattle, pigs, or goats were kept in a section of the same structure the family occupied, often separated from the human living area by only a low partition or simply an open connecting space. This arrangement, while certainly presenting sanitary challenges that would concern modern observers, served a genuinely important practical function, since the body heat generated by the standards of available medieval building technology, genuinely effective supplementary heating strategy that archaeological excavations of medieval peasant dwellings across northern Europe have confirmed as a widespread practice, particularly in regions with especially severe winter conditions. Beyond the practical warmth this arrangement provided, keeping livestock close at hand through the winter months also served the equally critical function of protecting a family's most valuable economic assets from both predators and weather exposure, since the loss of breeding livestock over a harsh winter could represent a genuinely catastrophic economic blow to a peasant household already operating with minimal surplus resources, meaning that the decision to share close living quarters with farm animals reflected not simply a lack of alternative options, but a carefully considered practical strategy addressing multiple genuine survival priorities simultaneously within the real constraints of medieval rural life. Chapter 4: Dressing for the Cold. Medieval clothing, particularly for the peasant and laboring classes who made up the majority of the population, relied heavily on a layering system built primarily around wool, a material that occupied a central, and, by modern standards, somewhat underappreciated position in medieval textile production precisely because of its genuinely effective insulating properties, even when damp, a significant practical advantage in a world without reliable synthetic alternatives or effective waterproofing technology. A typical medieval winter outfit for an ordinary working person involved multiple layers, beginning with an inner linen garment worn directly against the skin, since linen, unlike wool, could be washed more easily and helped manage moisture and body odor, topped with one or more woolen layers, including a fitted tunic or kirtle, and, for outdoor work or travel, a heavier woolen outer garment or cloak, frequently lined with fur for those who could afford it, since fur ranging from more affordable rabbit and cat pelts among poorer households to the highly prized and expensive ermine and sable reserved by sumptuary laws in many regions specifically for nobility, provided a genuinely superior level of insulation that medieval people clearly understood and valued. Headwear and hand coverings receive particular practical attention in medieval cold weather dress, since medieval people, through direct lived experience rather than formal medical knowledge of heat loss, understood that keeping the head, hands, and feet adequately covered and insulated was essential to overall body warmth, leading to the widespread use of woolen hoods, caps, and mittens across nearly all social classes during the winter months, along with thick woolen or, for wealthier individuals, fur-lined stockings and sturdy leather footwear, sometimes further insulated with straw. Packed inside the shoe itself, a genuinely practical and well-documented medieval innovation for managing the significant challenge of keeping feet warm and dry during outdoor winter labor, which remained, for the great majority of the medieval population, a continuing seasonal necessity regardless of the weather, since agricultural and other essential labor did not simply pause for the winter months. Chapter 5: The Great Autumn Slaughter. Perhaps no single event in the medieval agricultural calendar mattered more to winter survival than the period surrounding Martinus, the feast of Saint Martin observed on the 11th of November, which marked the traditional time across much of medieval Europe for the large-scale slaughter of livestock that could not realistically be fed and maintained through the winter months ahead. This timing reflected a genuinely practical agricultural calculation. Pasture and fodder supplies diminished sharply as autumn progressed, and maintaining a full summer-sized herd through the winter would rapidly exhaust a family's stored feed, meaning that medieval farmers made the deliberate and carefully calculated decision to slaughter a significant portion of their livestock, retaining only the core breeding stock that could be sustained through the leaner months, while converting the remainder into preserved meat that would provide essential protein through the winter and early spring, when fresh food sources became scarce. This preservation process relied on several complementary techniques, most centrally salting, in which meat was packed in salt or submerged in a strong brine solution to draw out moisture and inhibit bacterial growth, a method that required access to salt, itself a genuinely valuable and, in some regions, expensive commodity that shaped significant medieval trade networks, specifically due to its critical importance for food preservation. Smoking meat over a slow fire provided a complementary preservation method, adding both further moisture reduction and antimicrobial compounds from the wood smoke itself, while other preservation techniques included drying meat and fish in open air or over gentle heat, and the production of preserved fats such as lard, which provided both a long-lasting food source and cooking medium through the winter months. Grain, the other essential pillar of the medieval diet, required its own careful management, stored in dry conditions, specifically to prevent the mold and pest damage that could otherwise destroy a family's essential bread supply before winter's end, with medieval granaries and storage structures reflecting genuinely sophisticated accumulated practical knowledge regarding moisture control and pest prevention, developed through generations of hard-won agricultural experience. Chapter 6: Keeping the Fire Alive. Securing sufficient fuel to maintain fire through the entire winter season represented a genuinely significant and labor-intensive undertaking for medieval households, requiring careful planning that began, in practice, many months before the first cold weather arrived. Wood remained the primary fuel source across most of medieval Europe, and the gathering, cutting, and seasoning of an adequate winter woodpile constituted a substantial portion of a rural household's late summer and autumn labor, with medieval manorial records documenting the significant importance placed on access to woodland resources, since peasant communities frequently held specific, carefully regulated rights to gather fallen wood and cut limited quantities of timber from local forests, rights that manorial lords closely controlled and that formed a recurring subject of medieval legal and social tension between peasant communities and the landholding nobility who technically owned most forested land. In regions where wood proved scarce, medieval communities developed alternative fuel strategies reflecting genuine local ecological adaptation, including the use of dried peat in parts of the British Isles and Northern Europe, harvested from bogs during the summer months and dried for use as slower burning but genuinely effective winter fuel source, and in some particularly wood-scarce regions, dried animal dung served as a supplementary or even primary fuel source, a practice that, while unappealing by modern sensibilities, reflected practical necessity in the face of genuine environmental constraints. Beyond simply gathering fuel, medieval households also developed practical strategies for managing its use efficiently, including the deliberate banking of fires, covering hot coals with ash overnight to preserve embers that could be revived the following morning without requiring the labor and resources needed to start an entirely new fire from scratch. A small but genuinely significant practical technique that historians of medieval daily life note reflects the careful, resourceful fuel management that winter survival demanded of ordinary medieval households throughout the coldest months of the year. Chapter 7: Sickness in the Cold Months. Winter presented medieval communities with a genuinely elevated burden of illness and mortality, a pattern medieval physicians and ordinary people alike recognized empirically, even without the benefit of modern germ theory, to explain the underlying mechanisms involved. Respiratory illness proved particularly prevalent during the winter months, a consequence historians attribute to the combination of prolonged close-in indoor confinement during cold weather, the significant smoke exposure from indoor open hearths discussed in an earlier chapter, and the general nutritional stress many medieval households experienced as winter progressed and stored food supplies gradually diminished. A combination of factors that modern medical understanding confirms would indeed have significantly weakened immune resistance and increased vulnerability to respiratory infection during precisely this season. Medieval medical theory, still substantially grounded in the ancient framework of the four humors inherited from Greek and Roman medicine, generally categorized winter as a cold and wet season requiring specific dietary and behavioral adjustments to maintain proper bodily balance, leading physicians of the period to commonly recommend warming foods and beverages, along with reduced bathing, a recommendation that, as discussed extensively in an earlier account of hygienic practices in this era, aligned with broader period concerns regarding the health risks associated with water exposure during cold weather specifically. Beyond formal medical theory, ordinary medieval households relied heavily on accumulated practical and herbal knowledge for managing common winter ailments, including the use of specific herbs, honey, and warmed alcoholic beverages believed to possess genuine therapeutic properties, some of which modern research has confirmed did indeed offer modest genuine medicinal benefit, even though the broader theoretical framework medieval practitioners used to explain their effectiveness differed substantially from modern scientific understanding of disease and treatment. Chapter 8: Light in the Darkest Month. Against the genuine physical hardship of medieval winter, the season also brought some of the medieval calendar's most significant, and psychologically important communal celebrations, chief among them the Christmas season, which in medieval practice extended considerably beyond a single day, encompassing an extended period of feasting, rest from ordinary labor, and community gathering running from Christmas Day through Epiphany on the 6th of January, a period historians note provided genuinely important psychological and social relief during what was otherwise the most physically demanding and isolating stretch of the annual calendar. This extended winter festival period drew on both Christian religious observance and older seasonal customs associated with the winter solstice, the astronomical point marking the year's shortest day and longest night, which many pre-Christian European cultures had already marked with significant seasonal celebration long before Christianity's arrival, traditions that in many cases became integrated into or ran alongside the Christian Christmas observance across medieval Europe. The practical importance of this festival period extended beyond simple morale, since medieval Christmas feasting traditionally made deliberate use of provisions that required consumption before they spoiled or before spring planting demanded renewed physical labor, allowing households to enjoy genuine, if temporary, period of more generous eating precisely at the psychological midpoint of the difficult winter season, before the final and often most challenging weeks of late winter and early spring, when stored food supplies from the previous autumn's harvest had typically dwindled considerably, and the new growing season's first harvests remain still weeks or months away. Period medieval agricultural historians frequently identify as the genuine low point of the annual food security cycle, sometimes termed the Hungry Gap, making the earlier winter festival seasons' temporary abundance a meaningful and carefully anticipated counterbalance to the harder weeks of privation that reliably followed it before spring finally arrived. Chapter 9: Survival at the Edict of Nork. Communities living in the more extreme northern regions of medieval Europe, including Scandinavia, northern Scotland, and Iceland, developed particularly specialized winter survival strategies suited to conditions considerably more severe than those faced across most of the European mainland, reflecting genuine and sophisticated environmental adaptation accumulated over many generations. Norse and Icelandic communities, documented extensively through both archaeological evidence and the medieval Icelandic sagas, relied heavily on specific building techniques suited to their harsh environment, including turf-walled longhouses with exceptionally thick, densely packed sod construction, providing insulation properties that archaeological reconstruction and modern experimental archaeology have confirmed as genuinely effective against extreme cold, often incorporating a partially subterranean design that took practical advantage of the natural insulating properties of surrounding earth. Food preservation in these northern regions similarly reflected specific environmental adaptation, with Icelandic and Norwegian coastal communities developing sophisticated air-drying techniques for fish, producing a preserved product known as skrei, or stockfish, that could be stored for remarkably extended periods without salt, taking specific advantage of the cold, consistently dry air conditions available in these northern coastal environments, a preservation method that archaeological and historical trade records confirm became not only a critical local subsistence strategy, also a significant medieval export commodity, with dried Norwegian and Icelandic stockfish shipped to markets across medieval Europe, illustrating how a specific regional winter survival adaptation ultimately developed into a broader economic specialization with significant medieval trade network importance extending well beyond its original practical subsistence purpose. Chapter 10: Tubuyu Winters, Un Season. The experience of medieval winter varied dramatically according to social class, and the difference between how a peasant household and a noble household experienced the same winter season illuminates significant aspects of medieval social structure more broadly. Wealthy noble households, whether in rural manor houses or castle residences, benefited from genuinely significant material advantages during winter months, including stone construction offering considerably better structural durability and, when properly built with features such as thick walls and, in later medieval centuries, glazed windows, meaningfully superior insulation compared to the timber and wattle and daub peasant dwellings discussed earlier, along with access to more abundant fuel supplies, higher quality furs and woolens for clothing, and critically, substantially larger and more diverse stored food reserves that provided a meaningfully greater margin of safety against the genuine risk of winter food shortage that persistently threatened poorer households. Urban winter life, meanwhile, presented its own distinct set of circumstances, with medieval towns and cities generally offering somewhat more diverse and reliable access to purchased food and fuel through established markets, a genuine advantage compared to rural subsistence farming households. Entirely dependent on their own stored harvest, though urban poverty presented its own severe winter hardships, since the poorest urban residents, lacking either agricultural land or substantial savings, faced acute vulnerability to both food price increases during difficult winters and the significant fire and structural safety hazards associated with dense urban housing heated by open flame, a combination of risks that medieval municipal records document as a recurring and genuinely serious urban winter concern, distinct in its specific character from the primarily food security-focused winter challenges facing the rural peasant majority. Chapter 11: When Winter Turned Fatal. Despite the genuine accumulated practical knowledge and preparation strategies detailed throughout this account, medieval winters periodically overwhelmed even well-prepared communities, producing documented episodes of severe famine and significantly elevated winter mortality that stand among the most sobering chapters of medieval demographic history. The Great Famine of 1315 through 1317, affecting much of northern Europe, resulted from an extended period of unusually cold and excessively wet weather that severely damaged multiple consecutive harvests, producing a documented famine so severe that contemporary chronicles record instances of significant livestock death from inadequate fodder, substantially elevated human mortality across affected regions, and even documented, though historically abated in their full extent, accounts of extreme desperation, including instances of grave robbing for food, and in the most extreme and carefully scrutinized historical accounts, allegations of cannibalism during the famine's worst periods, illustrating just how severely a genuinely catastrophic run of poor harvests could overwhelm even the substantial accumulated preparation strategies medieval communities had developed over preceding generations. Beyond this single severe episode, medieval demographic and parish records more broadly confirm a persistent and statistically significant pattern of elevated winter and early spring mortality across ordinary, non-famine years as well, reflecting the cumulative physical toll of cold exposure, nutritional stress from diminishing stored food supplies, and elevated infectious disease burden discussed in earlier chapters, a pattern that historians studying medieval demography have documented consistently enough across surviving parish and manorial records to identify winter and early spring as the genuinely most demographically dangerous season of the medieval calendar year, a sobering statistical confirmation of the very real mortal stakes underlying the practical survival strategies this account has traced throughout its preceding chapters. Chapter 12: The Church's winter charity. Medieval monasteries and the broader institutional church played a genuinely significant and well-documented role in winter survival for the most vulnerable members of medieval society, reflecting both a formal religious obligation toward charitable giving and, in practical terms, the Church's position as one of medieval society's few institutions possessing the organizational capacity and accumulated material resources to provide meaningful assistance during periods of genuine winter hardship. Monastic almonries, dedicated institutional offices specifically responsible for distributing charity to the poor, maintain documented practices of providing food, and in some cases shelter, to destitute individuals during the winter months, with surviving monastic account records from across medieval Europe confirming that winter charitable distributions frequently increased in both frequency and scale compared to other seasons, a documented institutional recognition of winter's genuinely elevated hardship for the poorest members of surrounding communities. Beyond direct almsgiving, monasteries also served important winter community functions through their typically more substantial and better constructed physical infrastructure, including, in some documented cases, providing emergency shelter to travelers or local community members during periods of severe weather, and through their agricultural expertise and typically more sophisticated and better managed food storage capabilities, which some historians argue may have provided a degree of informal regional food security benefit to surrounding communities during difficult winters, beyond the monastery's own formal charitable obligations, illustrating how medieval religious institutions functioned, not merely as centers of spiritual life, but as genuinely significant practical components of the broader social and material infrastructure that helped medieval communities, however imperfectly and with genuinely serious remaining gaps for the most vulnerable, collectively navigate the recurring seasonal challenge of winter survival that shaped so much of medieval daily life and social organization. Chapter 13: The Slow Arrival of the Chimney. The enclosed chimney, channeling smoke upward through a dedicated flue rather than allowing it to disperse through the open hall as described in an earlier chapter, represents one of the more significant, if gradual, medieval architectural innovations affecting winter domestic life, though its adoption proceeded considerably more slowly and unevenly across medieval Europe than popular imagination sometimes assumes. Archaeological and architectural historical evidence indicates that true chimneys began appearing in wealthier European households, particularly among nobility and in urban merchant homes, from around the 12th century onward, initially as a genuinely expensive architectural feature requiring specialized masonry skill and considerable material investment in stone or brick construction, meaning that for several additional centuries, this significant improvement in indoor air quality and heating efficiency remained largely inaccessible to the ordinary peasant households that made up the great majority of the medieval population. The gradual spread of chimney technology to more ordinary homes accelerated significantly only toward the very end of the medieval period and into the early modern centuries that followed, a shift some architectural historians have termed the Great Rebuilding, particularly well documented in England. During the 16th century, when improving economic conditions for a growing portion of the population, combined with gradually decreasing construction costs for chimney technology, allowed a meaningfully broader segment of society to finally adopt this genuinely significant improvement to winter domestic comfort and health, meaning that the smoky, open-hearth medieval hall described earlier in this account remained the lived reality for the substantial majority of ordinary medieval families across nearly the entire span of the medieval period itself, with genuinely widespread chimney Adoption among common households representing, in most regions, a distinctly post-medieval historical development, rather than a medieval one. Chapter 14. When the wells froze. Access to water, an unavoidable daily necessity regardless of season, presented medieval communities with a specific and genuinely significant seasonal winter challenge, since the same freezing temperatures that necessitated the elaborate warming strategies discussed throughout this account also frequently rendered normal water sources considerably more difficult to access. Shallow wells, streams, and other common medieval water sources regularly froze, at least partially during severe winter weather across much of northern and central Europe, requiring the genuinely laborious daily task of breaking accumulated ice to reach usable water beneath, a routine winter core documented across numerous medieval manorial and municipal records as a recurring seasonal responsibility, sometimes formally assigned to specific household members or, in some monastic and manorial contexts, to designated servants specifically tasked with this essential daily winter maintenance work. In regions and periods of particularly severe cold, communities dependent on larger water sources, such as rivers for either drinking water or essential economic activities including milling grain, which required flowing water to power mill wheels, faced more serious seasonal disruption when these larger water bodies froze solidly enough to halt normal flow, a documented occurrence significantly more common during the colder, Little Ice Age centuries discussed in an earlier chapter, with the famous London Thames Frost Fairs held directly on the river's frozen surface during exceptionally cold winters, representing perhaps the most colorfully documented example of medieval and early modern communities adapting to this seasonal water disruption, transforming a genuine practical hardship, the complete freezing of a major working river, into an occasion for organized community commerce and celebration directly atop the ice itself, a vivid historical illustration of medieval resourcefulness in adapting even to winter's most extreme and disruptive manifestations. Chapter 15. A world that slowed but died not stop. Winter weather conditions significantly disrupted medieval travel and communication networks, with the poor and frequently unpaved condition of medieval roads becoming considerably more treacherous, and, in cases of significant snowfall or ice, occasionally entirely impassable for the wheeled carts and pack animals upon which medieval trade and communication substantially depended, a seasonal disruption documented extensively in medieval merchant and administrative correspondence, which frequently notes delayed shipments, postponed legal proceedings, and interrupted communication, specifically attributed to winter weather conditions across numerous surviving medieval records from throughout the period. This winter disruption to travel and trade carried genuine economic and social consequences, since medieval market towns and the broader trade networks connecting them relied on reasonably consistent transportation access for both essential goods and information, meaning that communities in more remote or difficult to access regions, particularly mountainous or otherwise geographically isolated areas, could face meaningfully extended periods of effective isolation during severe winter weather, a vulnerability that further underscored the practical importance of the autumn preparation and food storage strategies detailed earlier in this account. Since a community unable to rely on winter trade or outside assistance needed correspondingly more robust, self-sufficient preparation to safely navigate the season, a reality that shaped medieval settlement patterns and community planning in ways that continue to interest historians studying the practical relationship between medieval geography, infrastructure, and seasonal vulnerability across the period. Chapter 16. The Youngest and the Oldest. Medieval winter mortality, as documented through surviving parish and manorial records discussed in an earlier chapter, fell with particular and well-documented severity upon the youngest and oldest members of medieval communities, a pattern consistent with modern medical understanding regarding the elevated physiological vulnerability of both very young children and elderly individuals to cold exposure, nutritional stress, and respiratory illness, even though medieval communities lacked the specific scientific framework to fully articulate the underlying biological mechanisms involved. Infant and early childhood mortality, already substantially elevated by modern standards across all seasons due to the genuine limitations of medieval medical knowledge and practice, showed documented additional seasonal elevation during winter months in the surviving demographic records historians have analyzed, reflecting the compounding practical challenges of maintaining adequate warmth and nutrition for particularly vulnerable young children during the most physically demanding stretch of the annual calendar. Elderly members of medieval communities faced a distinct but similarly significant set of winter vulnerabilities, including reduced physical capacity for essential winter labor such as fuel gathering and food preparation, and documented historical evidence suggests that medieval family and community structures generally recognized and attempted to address this specific vulnerability through practical arrangements, including designated roles for elderly household members involving less physically demanding winter tasks, and within the charitable structures discussed in an earlier chapter. Regarding monastic and church support, specific attention to elderly individuals lacking sufficient family support as a recognized category of winter charitable priority, reflecting a genuine, if practically limited by the real material constraints of the period, medieval social awareness regarding which community members faced the greatest winter survival risk and required particular attention and support. Chapter 17: Wool, the medieval Lefeline. The medieval sheep, and the wool economy built around it, deserves particular attention within any thorough account of medieval winter survival, given wool's central and repeatedly discussed role throughout this account as the primary material basis for medieval winter clothing and bedding. Sheep farming held genuinely significant economic importance across medieval Europe, with regions including England developing substantial specialized wool production and export industries that historians of medieval economic history identify as among the most significant commercial sectors of the period, a specialization that reflected both favorable environmental conditions in certain regions and the sustained, genuinely high demand for wool textiles that winter survival needs, alongside broader clothing demand, generated across medieval society. The processing of raw wool into usable winter textiles involved a genuinely labor-intensive sequence of specialized tasks, including shearing, cleaning, carding to align the fibers, spinning into usable thread, and finally weaving into cloth, a production chain that occupied significant labor within medieval households and communities, frequently organized around the seasonal rhythm of the agricultural calendar, with much of the actual spinning and weaving labor traditionally falling to women within medieval households, work that itself often continued through the winter months as an indoor task suited to the season when outdoor agricultural labor necessarily diminished, meaning that the wool clothing and blankets essential to winter survival represented the end product of a substantial and carefully organized annual production cycle that itself relied on medieval households successfully navigating the very seasonal challenges that wool products were, in turn, designed to help them survive. Chapter 18: Bread, Ale, and the Winter Table. The medieval winter diet, beyond the preserved meat discussed in an earlier chapter, centered heavily on grain-based foods, particularly bread, which constituted the single most significant caloric source for the great majority of the medieval population across all seasons, with winter bread typically produced from whatever grain reserves a household had successfully stored from the previous harvest, sometimes supplemented, or, during genuinely difficult years, substituted with lower quality grains, or even, in documented cases of significant hardship, adulterated with ground legumes, acorns, or other less desirable but calorically valuable additions when primary supplies ran short before the arrival of spring's first harvest. Brewed from grain and consumed by medieval people of essentially all ages and social classes, served a genuinely important nutritional and practical function within the medieval winter diet, beyond its role as a beverage of casual enjoyment, providing meaningful caloric content and, significantly, representing a safer beverage option than potentially contaminated water sources in an era before germ theory allowed for reliable water safety assessment. Since the brewing process itself provided a degree of incidental protection against certain waterborne pathogens, a practical benefit medieval people recognized empirically through accumulated experience, even without understanding its precise scientific basis. Winter brewing itself followed its own seasonal logic within medieval households, and the growing number of dedicated medieval brewing establishments, with the cooler winter temperatures generally considered favorable for certain brewing process, meaning that ale production, much like the wool textile production discussed in the preceding chapter, represented another significant medieval household and community economic activity whose practical rhythm was itself shaped by and adapted to the same seasonal winter conditions this account has traced throughout its preceding chapters. Closing reflection on the medieval winter, as this account has traced across its preceding chapters, was never simply endured passively but was met, year after year, with an extraordinary and genuinely impressive body of accumulated practical knowledge, careful seasonal planning, and communal cooperation, from the careful autumn calculations determining which livestock would be slaughtered and which retained, to the specific insulating properties of wattle and daub or turf construction suited to local environmental conditions, to the elaborate and carefully timed food preservation techniques that had to sustain entire households across months without fresh harvest. This was survival built not on any single dramatic innovation, but on the patient accumulation of countless small, practical adaptations, refined across many generations of genuinely hard-won experience, and passed down through direct practical instruction, rather than formal written record for the great majority of the medieval population who left no personal written account of their own. Understanding this quiet, persistent, and remarkably sophisticated struggle against the cold offers a genuinely valuable corrective to any modern tendency to view medieval people as simply primitive or passive victims of their circumstances, revealing instead a civilization that, working within the real and often severe constraints of its available technology and knowledge, developed a remarkably thorough and carefully calibrated set of strategies for meeting winter's genuine annual threat to survival, strategies whose basic underlying logic of careful preparation, resourceful adaptation, mutual community support remains recognizable and instructive even across the many centuries that separate their world from our own. Thank you for watching my channel. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Have a good night.